to be, or towards the pastoral idealization of just human nature in general. So that'd
Right.
be the area that I would look at, but I've written it down.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Please.
Yes, this is for Kevin. I found this very interesting because I'm working with something on Philip de Mornay and Philip Sidney on the translation of de Mornay's the English title, The Trueness of the Christian Religion. And I came across something that mentioned that Sidney had done had attempted a translation of Du Bartas. Have you ever come across any references to either Sidney or to Philip de Mornay in your things? Because one of the things I'm interested in is how they treat the natural world in the trueness of the Christian religion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. So I think in Peter Auger's work on Du Bartas in Britain, he talks about. I think it's pretty accepted that Sidney did write something, but it was lost. And he speculates that one of the reasons that writers didn't take up the project of translating Du Bartas in England until a little bit later in the 16th century might have been because it was generally known that this kind of copy of Sidney's translation was out there somewhere, right? So no one wanted to, and there were certainly other translators working in the period, a number of people, but I think it's thought to be lost now. There's no knowledge of it, but in the period, it was kind of assumed that this translation was out there.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's got me running down another rabbit trail. So thank you.
Sure.
Other questions?
I have a question, and this is a sort of particular point of follow-up for Kevin. When you were talking about Du Bartas's sort of contesting, the sense of Adam's dominion over Earth, and the suggestion that that actually went away with the fall. So I've never heard that notion. Is that a common theological perspective, or does that come from Du Bartas? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think, and from what I've seen, and I'd have to do more research to answer it fully, but that was one of, especially earlier in the 16th century, that was one of the kind of standard positions that humanity had this dominion, but it was lost, or at least partially lost with the fall. And even I think in Bacon's writing, he talks about trying to regain that dominion that had been lost by this new kind of method for understanding nature. So there are degrees, I think, of how much people thought it was lost, how much people thought it was recoverable, what the exact relationship in this post-lapsarian world was between humans and the rest of nature. But I think it was a pretty widespread opinion that in some way the fall had at least compromised that dominion, if not entirely negated it. And Du Bartas seems to kind of take a firmer stand toward the more severe consequences. In the translation, pretty directly, that dominion is lost once the fall happens, and we have a different kind of relationship with nature than we had before.
Thank you. And thanks for your paper. That was really illuminating. So.
Oh, thank you so much.
If no one else has, go ahead, please, Scott. I'm sorry.
Meg, I enjoyed hearing your paper, and I worked mostly in the 16th century, not 17th century. So I was struck when you mentioned that the sort of trope of chaos and ruin ensuing when the aristocrat leaves the country house, and I was wondering if that trope is played with during the Revolution, the English Revolution, and the aftermath, and in what way. Most people not working in that period tend to know the one poem, the country house poem, is Upon Appleton House, which is, of course, General Fairfax of the parliamentarians, as the man of that manor, as it were. And so I was just wondering how all that played together.
Absolutely, that's a great question. And I am hoping to do more research on more poems dealing with country houses. But I think in particular, both of these can sort of look at that idea that when the country, or when the gentility is gone from the country house, it does have this sort of idea of ruin. I think Margaret Cavendish's poem, The Ruin of the Island, of This Island, which is the follow-up to the one that I discussed, talks about that very explicitly. And I think you can also see some of that in Lanier's, although of course with Lanier, it's not dealing with the revolution per se. It came out in 1611, so it was a little bit earlier than that. But just the general idea of the sort of house as being a fortress, and the life within that house being the gentry, the aristocracy, and that when the sort of virtuous, perhaps even divine, in the case of Cavendish, when she discusses her patron, that sort of divine presence is removed, sort of death comes in that place. And I think in Cavendish, she was referring, of course, I think to the revolution, but I don't think that's necessary, that it has to be dealing with the revolution. So yeah, I think that is interesting that you bring up that Upon Appleton House is more of a parliamentarian side. So of course, now I want to go look at that and make a comparison paper of those two. But I think that's a really good question. I hope that that sort of answered it, but I'm definitely wanting to do some research on that now. Thank you.
Thank you. Think of that, the Upon Appleton House with Fairfax's displeasure towards the end of the Civil War would be a very interesting to look at.
Right, because I mean, if it's been a while since I've actually looked at that one, but correct me if I'm wrong, he did sort of repent of his joining with the parliamentarian forces towards the end. Is that true?
He thought they went too far, exactly, and retired, as it were, if I remember correctly, to Appleton House. Right,
which I think is really interesting, because if you look at him sort of retreating back into that ideal, he's sort of realizing that maybe he shouldn't have pushed that ideal over. I mean, for whatever we think about that, he's sort of making that choice, and then is sort of wrapping himself in that identity again, which I think is, yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, feel free to ask more questions. So please do.
Bouncing off of that question and the effect of the Civil War, I was curious, Nick, have you thought about ways in which, does the depiction of the forest change under Charles I or during the Restoration at all? Because I know you mentioned how Cromwell's is depicted as cutting down an oak tree in your presentation. So I was wondering if there were any more connections.
Sure. So I came across a few other sources. I sort of honestly cut my search around right at the Civil War, because you can't go on forever. But I did notice that, and what I was finding was a lot of the tree and forest as country as it got closer and closer towards the end of my search parameters. So it still remained monarchy in some capacities, but more and more they said, hey, the forest is England, the forest is England, the forest is England. Unless the forest is Charles, the forest is Charles, the forest is Charles. But I would be hesitant to expand that beyond what I saw, and to make any sweeping gestures. But that's what I noticed in my reading.
Other questions?
If I could make another comment, especially maybe a connection between Kevin's and Margaret's papers, and that is that as we were discussing, the absence of the Lord from the landscape, that is the nobility from the landscape, presages its decline and destruction. That is, in many ways, a representation of this idea of divine dominion inherited by humanity that's given at creation. And so, of course, the Lord being at the top of the social hierarchy represents that principle of order. In many Reformed understandings, and well into the 19th and 20th centuries, various forms of Calvinism have continued to emphasize the idea of right dominion over creation, not as exploitation, but rather as stewardship. That the natural world is in some sense incomplete without the stewardship of humanity. It can't really prosper and thrive without the proper human management at its center. That's I suppose you could say a pan-Protestant idea, and in many ways Catholic as well. So I wonder if you might want to reflect on that linkage between your two arguments, or not. It's just my comment.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's a very explicit sort of divine kingship, particularly in Cavendish's poem, where you literally have someone who's divine sort of standing in for Charles. And I think so. I think in Nick's paper, I was particularly struck by the idea of sort of projecting an urban environment onto nature and then nature onto sort of an urban environment. And I think you can really see that, I think, in both poems that I looked at, but I think particularly in the description of an island, where it's all about sort of urbanifying nature. I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah, I would agree that I saw a lot of connections between both of our papers for sure.
And I would agree too. I would just say you definitely see in Du Bartas, going back to that idea of lost dominion with what happens, the consequences of the Lord kind of falling, right? There are consequences throughout nature. All of nature becomes more corrupted at this moment of fall, which it sounds like overlaps a lot with that idea.
I think of the motto of the city of Chicago where I used to live, Herbis in Urbis. That is a garden in the city. I mean, I love Chicago despite all of its obvious problems. And that seems to be a kind of ideal that relates to the Garden of Eden and then the final chapters of the book of Revelation, the two bookends of the whole Christian Bible, where finally the city incorporates the garden and they merge together. A garden by itself is not the full plan of the Almighty. He intends people to live together in habitation, but that habitation must be beautifully integrated somehow with the green world. And so Herbis in Urbis maybe is what we're striving for, and I hope they achieve in Chicago.
One quick note on that too, to sort of reemphasize what Kevin was just saying about the connection, the sort of Edenic connection. I didn't get to this in my paper, but people are conspicuously absent in both poems that I looked at. Instead of having servants or courtiers or anything like that, you see natural things sort of taking the place. So winds, trees, birds, things like that becoming the people, which I think does go back to this sort of pre-Lapsarian idea of all of nature serving man and maybe just man being alone with nature as well.
Hi, this is Rachel Roberts. I've been trying to turn this into a question, but I'm sorry, I can't. A couple of other works of the period that are coming to mind with all three of these papers. I'm just going to kind of toss them out there. If anyone else is familiar with them, please feel free to comment. One I've been thinking of is Isabella Whitney's Will and Testament, which is, it's quite early, 1573, so it might be too early for y'all's projects, but it's a detailed description of the city of London. That's very much, it's sort of like a precursor to the country house appearance of London, where there's all these details about what the city does and who lives there and so on. And it seems like if we're talking about the city and nature, that might be appropriate. And then there's a tiny little piece by Dorothy Calthorpe called A Description of the Garden of Eden, in which the Garden of Eden is, it's a 17th century garden. So it's got greenhouses and fountains and paved paths and statuary. It's not Milton's kind of Eden running all over the place, but it's very kind of ordered and regimented. I forget what year that is, I'm sorry. But I think for some or all of these projects, those could be interesting additions to our questions of nature and people. Thanks.
Okay, Dave, I think we saw your hand up, so you get the last question. Oh, just unmute yourself. Thank you for that, Rachel.
I think we've already covered it when I talked with Kevin.
Oh, okay.
So I'm good.
Good. Okay. Well, anybody else have a final question they'd like to ask? In that case, I'll just note how intriguingly breath-like this panel was. On the one hand, sort of imagining the relationship between nature and urban space and human life as fully integrated, but also at the same time, in Kevin's paper in particular, envisioning a kind of fragmentation that doesn't seem to be a real obstacle to understanding, but rather if I understood correctly, is almost indicative of a methodological approach that fits with natural history. So well done, Chris Crosby and those who put these papers together. I found them quite intriguing and lovely, and can't wait to see written versions so that I can spell all the names correctly that I'm sure I've misspelled in my notes. So we are now coming up to 5 minutes left on this, our maiden panel, and having troubleshot some sketchy moments and come through to the other side. I'm inclined to say thank you again, and thank you to my co-hosts who helped do that so effectively. Yes, yay. And yeah, let's give a round of unmuted applause to the speakers. It's dimmed by virtual space, but not by actual. All right, so we have a break now for 15 minutes. If you'd like to have a few minutes to yourself, please come back and join us again at 2:45 for our next panel. Thank you. Oh, my head's in the way.